Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
In the online universe, the idea of sharecropping is pretty widespread. That we all become as sharecroppers on somebody else's website. And it's sort of similar, if I put a thermostat or whatever it is into my house, and the first thing it does is it tells everything it finds out about me. It tells some big overlord in the sky, but not me. Then I'm not so certain that it is really my thermostat. I think it is somebody else's thermostat that I just happen to have in my house.
When we buy an IoT product for our home or our business, the advice is the same. Read the fine print. There are plenty of technical obstacles that can be thrown in your way to stop you from having complete control over your data. But sometimes the devil is in the details. And those contractual details can have a major effect on your business. In this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with Johannes Ernst about the IoT Overlords and the upcoming data showdown.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is for business leaders and managers employing the Internet of Things for their business or the business of their customers. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair, and I interview the industry's leading authorities to find out how they use IoT to improve business and create value. If you like this show, subscribe to it on iTunes and go to iotinc.com to check out my complimentary articles, videos, meetups, and webinars.
I have to warn you, this isn't going to be pretty. Right from the start, the sound quality of this interview is going to be horrible. We re-recorded it even, and it was still no better. Although horrible, it's worth your time. It's worth your time to hear some fresh thinking on maintaining data control and some important issues to consider when buying IoT tech. Low quality, but high value. And as a book update, my manuscript was delivered to McGraw-Hill around 10 days ago. If you're one of my 40-plus reviewers, thank you. Your comments and suggestions elevated the book from good to great. With me today on the IoT show is Johannes Ernst. Johannes is a serial entrepreneur and technologist with over 20 years of experience. He started indie computing to enable individuals to have more control over their online lives and the online lives of their things. Johannes was an early and active member of my IoT Silicon Valley meetup. I saw what he was doing recently, and I decided to invite him on the show. Johannes, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
So what have you been up to lately?
Oh, well, lots of different things. I think the world, continues to go not quite in the direction that many of us would like to see. And I think our things, our smart things, and our remotely controlled things have, I think, a bigger role to play there going forward than perhaps all of us would like. And I think working on technologies and products that perhaps put more control in the hands of the users might not be such a bad idea.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, so what we've been doing in the actually perhaps since the web became big, there's this big pendulum that goes back and forth in technology every so many decades, perhaps between centralization and decentralization. And of course, on the web, what has happened is that instead of having a more and more decentralized technology universe, we've gotten more and more centralized services like Facebook and Google and so forth and so forth. And first it was just the sites, but now all of our data has essentially gone into some big silos where something happens to it, although it's not entirely clear what that is because we can see that from the outside world. And unfortunately, we're on the same track with the things that we have in our house, which we used to own, free and clear. but now they come tethered to somebody else's cloud, and I don't think that's a good trend. I don't think it's a good trend for the business nor for the individual, as it puts more people into actually puts a smaller number of large companies in very controlling positions. I think if we had a more decentralized and a more distributed world where more people could innovate and do things the way they see fit, would actually be a better system.
So a decentralized IoT, is that kind of what you're advocating for?
I'm advocating a number of different things. I call it indie IoT, for lack of a better term, indie as an independent, and as we had indie music and various kinds of indie arts, The core feature here would be that the kind of things that we buy that now come with smarts in them should be usable in a way like anything else that isn't smart that we have bought, that does not depend on third parties that have a veto over what we do with these things long after we bought them.
The overlords.
The overlords. Well, yeah. I mean, there's been that's my terminology. There's been different terms over the years. How people describe that. In the online universe, the idea of sharecropping is pretty widespread. So if we all become as sharecroppers on somebody else's website, and it's sort of similar. If I put a thermostat or whatever it is into my house, and the first thing it does is it tells everything it finds out about me. It tells some big overlord in the sky, but not me. Then I'm not so certain that it is really my thermostat.
Right.
I think it is somebody else's thermostat that I just happen to have in my house. In the online universe, the idea of sharecropping is pretty widespread. So if we all become as sharecroppers on somebody else's website. And it's sort of similar, if I put a thermostat or whatever it is into my house, and the first thing it does is it tells everything it finds out about me. It tells some big overlord in the sky, but not me. Then I'm not so certain that it is really my thermostat. I think it is somebody else's thermostat that I just happen to have in my house.
All right. Well, looks like we're going to have some fun. Why don't we start off with just some basics? Tell everyone about yourself and your background in IoT.
Sure. So myself, I'm an electrical engineer by background, by education. However, I've never really done anything in electrical engineering other than a teenage hobby stuff in my basement. That was before I went to school. But I'm a software guy and I'm an entrepreneur. I started out working on embedded software hardware systems in automotive at BMW back in Germany, and then worked on various kinds of tools for building these kinds of systems. And started some companies, built a graph database, had a hand in decentralized user identity on the internet, which turned into OpenID. Built some software in healthcare, mobile software in healthcare before the iPhone, which was interesting. And so, more recently.
Was there before the iPhone?
It sounds like it's been forever, but it has only been a few years.
Yeah, we're going 10 or 12 or something. Right? Yeah. Okay.
And more recently, so I'm building a Linux distribution called UBoss, which is specifically made for what I call personal servers, which are server computers that we can keep in our homes and do a lot of the things that we otherwise would use other people's clouds for in our homes. And it runs from something as small as a Raspberry Pi Zero for $5 all the way up to fairly beefy servers. And there's apps on it that turn that server into something that is easy to administer and easy to use, from file sharing to blogging to wikis to open source Slack to all sorts of things.
So Pi Zero will actually run your server software.
Yes. So it's really interesting. It used to be in the IoT world as well as in the embedded world that we used to think that the kind of hardware we need to use for pure cost reasons, cannot really run any reasonable software.
Right.
But I don't think that is true anymore. And the Raspberry Pi Zero proves that. I mean, for $5, you get a board that runs a fairly reasonable, ARM processor. You can run full-fledged Linux on it. Well, in order to turn this into a real server, you want to have an actual hard drive and not just an SD card and stuff like that. But it shows that, at $5 and they're producing it and supposedly making a profit on it, it's not entirely clear if the device then eventually gets sold for $99. If, going down to $3 makes a whole lot of a difference if what you get is a whole lot more functionality.
Well, go back a little bit in your experience in IoT. So how long has it been that you've been working on IoT?
Well, on and off over the years. When I thought about this the other day, I was thinking, the first IoT system I built was when I was maybe 12 years old or 11 or something like that. Oh. There wasn't an internet yet, but it was a fish feeding machine and that I built to feed the fish for my family when we went on vacation. But there was no internet yet, but today it would probably run an Arduino or something like that and be accessible over the internet. It had a sensor to figure out when it was getting daylight and would feed the fish and switch on the lamp during the day. And amazingly enough, the fish survived. It actually worked. And so,
that's amazing, even with or without this food point or this food feeder. But anyway.
Right. So on and off. I think I've built a bunch of things like that just for my own amusement, for my own for own home innovation, so to speak.
So it's been home IoT, and you're saying since age 12. I don't know, everyone. This might be a record. Everyone will kind of look back and squint their eyes and say they're working in IoT at some point. I can only go back around, 10 years maybe. I think it's actually more like 8. I've heard some people 15, but this is a record, I think.
Well, with qualifiers, right? Strictly speaking, there was no internet involved, so that's not entirely fair.
You want to decentralize your IoT anyway, don't you?
Yeah. Absolutely.
They go up to the clouds. So, all right. So you talked a little bit about indie computing, and I think I understand it, but maybe where I'm a little bit confused is the difference between, or is there a difference between indie computing and open source IoT, or indie IoT, I should say, and open source IoT?
So there is. So there is. Maybe the best way of looking at this is that there are several dimensions of control that one can have over various kinds of aspects of technology. And in the open source world, the control that the vendor essentially, or the developer essentially gives up is the control over the secrets in the code, right? So you can actually see what is going on, and then of course control over who gets to do what with that code. And others can contribute or fork or use it in various ways the developer didn't necessarily anticipate. So the code part is important to this, but there's two other parts, and one of them is the data. For example, if Amazon or Google built their empire largely on open source software, and there's many reasons to believe that doesn't mean we have our data that they manage for us. They still hold our data hostage in various ways. Okay. And you notice every time one of the big websites shuts down, and not the Googles of the world, but the second tier websites shuts down, you realize that all of a sudden all sorts of data that you had there is lost. And so there's this control over data that I think we need to we as individuals that produce that data have to reassert. Imagine if in your house, if the vendor, whose system you have goes out of business, suddenly, as a very least, you're losing the historical record of what your heater did or what your various devices did in your house. Which may or may not be so critical for an IT system, but it is critical for a lot of other things. Your family photos should not necessarily disappear. And then the third dimension of control is the terms of use. It's all very nice, but pretty much all IoT systems that come with a cloud component come with terms of use. And these terms of use are not necessarily constant either. And so it may very well be that 3 years after you put some system in your house, all of a sudden the terms of use change for whatever reasons. There is no appeals process. And so there's now a part of your house that you cannot use the way you thought you were going to use. when you installed it, which is really strange. And I mean, it might happen in a rented apartment, but should it happen in our houses?
Right. So is that then, if you were to look at it generally speaking, is that the biggest difference, the data component with respect to open source versus indie?
I think all of them are important, but for me personally, I think the data is really, really important because if I have access to the data and I can do things with the data the way I want without having to have any kind of official or tacit approval, I can do interesting things. I can integrate with any other product, or any other vendor can integrate with the products that I have. I can hack it, I can modify it, I can innovate on it. Conversely, if somebody else has the data and it is hiding behind some term of use, for example, it's really difficult for a new innovative vendor to innovate in that ecosystem. Because they need permission from the overlord, and of course the reason why they need permission from overlord is exactly so that the overlord has a veto over who does and does not get to connect to their customer base. And while that might be great from the overlord's perspective, it's not so great for everybody else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I come at this from a slightly different perspective, but I think we're reaching the same conclusion. And my perspective is from a business risk, and your perspective, if I understand it correctly, you have a home device and it's storing data in the cloud. If it gets bricked, if the company goes out of business, for example, which we've seen a few times in IoT, then this is a big problem, especially if there's valuable things like photos on there. My perspective is a little different in that, and that's also important, but my perspective is from a business perspective. If you then sign up for a cloud provider or an IoT platform provider that includes the cloud, and you don't have the control over the data, then that's a big trouble. That's a big problem, specifically if they change their mind in their direction, they get acquired and someone else changes their mind for them, or they go out of business. And so this goes beyond the open source, because I would say, and what I do with my clients is I say, all right, let's make sure that in the provisions, if we are going to go with a non-open source, so a commercial platform, and let's make sure we get the open, we get the keys, we get all the keys, we have escrow for the open source. Not that we want to have to deal with it, but it's certainly, something that, that's necessary. But you're extending it a little bit further, which I think makes a lot of sense. And this is how somehow having data, what's the right terminology here? Data ownership, I suppose, but it's more being able to access your data at any time, download your data. Help me out here.
Well, it's for me the real interesting question is actually, can you delete it? If you can delete it, you usually have enough control over it that you can do most other things.
Right.
Okay, this is a little tongue in cheek, but I think it is an interesting dimension to throw at this. And I think it is also very important because for IoT applications, unlike the typical internet cloud kind of applications, the lifetimes of the products that we are looking at potentially are much, much longer, and so the risk compounds. A couple of years ago, I replaced the windows in my house, and it turned out that the manufacturer of the old windows that were in there had actually gone out of business like 15 years or something before that. I only found out by accident. Now, I didn't actually realize that, and it wasn't important because I actually owned my windows. So there was no connection to the business anymore. However, if I now bought new windows, and I'm making this up because I didn't do that, but if I bought new windows that say had some sensors in it for whether windows open or closed, or glass breakage, or moisture, or anything like that, these kinds of wonderful things that we all talk about when we talk about the IoT, then what would have happened is that halfway through the life of my windows, they would have stopped working. And it is not obvious that there would be any kind of remedy that I would have had in this case. What I obviously should have, I should have the ability sort of redirect those windows to some other vendor that is willing to pick up the customers from the old vendor. But of course, we building our IoT systems in a way to intentionally prevent that. I have to say it that way. I have not seen a single consumer-related IoT system that had any kind of, call it upgrade or migration path in it that did not involve the original vendor. And I think that also depresses the market. I mean, I would never buy such windows with 30 years or whatever expected lifetime, unless I was quite certain that these windows would continue to function for most of the time of those 30 years. Why would I do that? I mean, it'd be insane to make such a purchase. I think it's not just better for business in terms of risk reduction, and it's not, as you say, and I totally agree. And in terms of innovation, because other people can connect that didn't necessarily even exist at the time the original purchase was made. But it's also better to sell to customers like me who realize that these kinds of things, come with lock-in may stop working. And
Well, what I was going to say was, and I remember what I wanted to say earlier was data portability, and just the concept that you can take your data. Delete it if you like, but also perhaps move it somewhere else. I think that's an important concept. But, what you're saying with the window analogy, which I think is good, it's kind of two parts. One is this data portability, although you didn't touch on it that much just now, being able to know what your history was, because perhaps in some way your analytics requires that, or some other, something else requires it. But you're saying also being able to access it. So the business lesson here is, if you do sign up with an overlord, a platform manufacturer, a cloud provider, then number one, you should be able to get your data, delete your data, access your data, move your data to another cloud at any time. And number two, you should have a very clear way, which I think you would though, right? You're going to have the APIs, whatever the software development kit, but you should have a very clean way that you can connect up to that data in different ways, but they already provide that, don't they? So in your window analogy, there would already be a mechanism to connect up your windows to other service providers, or am I missing something?
Well, so let's look at the technology for a second. It can be implemented in different ways, but there is somewhere inside your IoT product in the home, there is presumably a URL that points to the vendor's cloud. And if the vendor is, vendor.com, then it will be something like IoT.vendor.com. As soon as vendor.com goes out of business, that product will stop working. The question is now, can we somehow change that URL to some new vendor.com? And that today would, at the very minimum, require the cooperation of the old vendor, because the old vendor is the only one that can update the code on the device. Right. So it isn't quite. So when I go back to my three dimensions of control, it is very important that we have access to the code on the device as well. Because otherwise, there's no way that we can redirect the device to somebody else's cloud.
So the three dimensions, remind me again.
Code, which is control over code, which is the one closest to open source. Data and terms of service.
Data in terms of service. Okay, and data we're kind of covering in terms of data portability. And in terms of service, which is an interesting one, and you're saying there may be some restrictions. Can you expand a little further on the terms of service?
Sure. So let's say I am a new innovative vendor of some cool new system that, say, optimizes energy in the home by wanting to do something cool between thermostats and air conditioning units and solar panels and whatever it is, right? And so I look and say, I could come up with this very cool algorithm here that optimizes, for certain customers this in a particular way. All I need to do is connect to the customer's existing air conditioning systems and thermostats and all of that kind of stuff. Now, in order to do this with the architectures that we have putting in place today, I essentially have to go to the vendor of all of those systems and ask them nicely, can I please connect to your API? And depending on which stage of the market they're in, they might say, oh, of course, or they will say, under no circumstances. And as soon as they get big and it works really well, they will, as we've seen most recently with Twitter, Twitter went out in the early stages of the company and recruited everybody to program towards the Twitter API, wide variety of clients and all sorts of integrations around Twitter, till they decided that they wanted to take a whole bunch of these things in-house, and all of a sudden there was an official Twitter client, and all the others were killed off because the terms of service prevented them from connecting to Twitter. Why? Because it's a very rational business strategy for Twitter to basically take more of the pieces of the ecosystem in-house in order to bolster their business. But of course, it cuts everybody else's short. Now, in this particular case of the house, what would happen is that great new algorithm would stop working. And it is not entirely clear that the vendor, in the Twitter analogy, the overlord would ever replace it with something that serves the same customers. And the upstart vendor, the upstart innovator here has no remedy, because the terms of service are what they are. And the homeowner doesn't have a remedy either. So it locks out. The terms of service become a point of control to lock out others.
Interesting. No, I think everyone should be listening to this. This is an important point, and it's one I have to admit that I haven't really dug into that much. And now, as you're talking, I'm trying to think, okay, what's the remedy? Because that's what I do. I solve problems, according to my wife. So what's the remedy here? And what is a remedy, Johannes? Is it then having your lawyer look at the terms of service and maybe put a provision in there? And I'm talking from a commercial point of view. We're either signing onto an IoT platform or cloud service. Is it having your lawyer look at the terms of service and put a provision in there that says you can't change them? Or what do you think?
Well, I think that's not quite realistic, because terms of service, like everything else, has bugs, and sometimes they simply have to be updated because there's something in there that wasn't intended. So I'm not sure that really works. I think the remedies are different depending who you are in this. So as an individual, as consumers, as an end customer of this one, I think the correct approach is to simply be very aware of the fact that your systems may not ever work the way you want them to work, or will stop working the way you want them to work, and be okay with that, or simply look for solutions that do not have these dimensions of lock-in. And so far there have been very few products out on the market. One of the reasons why I'm going up there and sort of evangelizing in alternate architecture. Yes. But in the maker movement, there is a ton of people who building really interesting IoT kind of systems that have none of those problems. Why? Because they tend to be open source, open software, open hardware, and that cures a lot of ills. And then they tend to be open enough that if they do depend on the cloud, and they very often don't depend on the cloud because one can build a lot of useful IT functionality without needing a cloud at all. But if they do need a cloud, then it becomes replaceable because it's open protocols, and perhaps the software that runs in the cloud is open source too. And there are no terms of service at all, because it is just what it is. It's the product as it is built. And it's for me, it's flabbergasting how we are sort of all accept the idea that all of a sudden parts of our houses come with terms of service. I mean, it's like, you go to the hardware store and you buy yourself a new faucet, and the faucet comes with fine print and says, I'm sorry, you can only use this faucet under these circumstances. This is very strange.
I'm just listening to what you're saying in terms of the solution, and you're saying one of them I'm sort of gathering is open protocol. So even if the terms of service do change, you can still access your data on the cloud, and that requires that transparency or that data portability. Is that kind of where you're leading with this?
I was talking more from the perspective of the consumer, but not from the perspective of a business. I think the open source world has come up with this term of forkability, having the ability to fork, and what it essentially means in this context, where it goes a bit beyond open source itself, is the ability to pick up and leave and do without killing off your system because the circumstances in which you started out have deteriorated so that you don't want to be there anymore. In this case, packing up and leave basically means that you have to have the ability to buy from another vendor or develop it yourself without loss of substantial functionality. And that means you have to be able to get your data over, you have to get alternate cloud implementation in place, you have to be able to redirect your devices that you have deployed to that new system you built or bought, and that without the cooperation or acquiescence of the original platform vendor.
And I know this isn't a correct term, but aren't you saying, we want open source software, we open source hardware, and aren't you saying we kind of want open source data, which really implies open source cloud? Is that a cover?
I don't think so. So I don't think, strictly speaking, we actually need open source in the strict legal definition of what open source is. Right? Open source is a trademark, and it has very specific criteria for what it means. I don't think we necessarily need exactly the spirit of forkability is really, really important.
Being able to fork your cloud as well as your hardware and your software.
I think so. Well, let's make it a concrete example. Let's say I bought myself a Nest thermostat. And let's say, for whatever reason, at some point I'd like to basically cut ties with Google. How do I do that? Well, practically speaking, I would need the ability to put alternate code onto the thermostat itself. So I need to be able to flash out, because otherwise it will keep talking to Google, right? And then I have to have the ability to take whatever historical data and what other data that is valuable that came from my thermostat and take it out of the Google Cloud and put it in some other cloud. Now, we don't actually know exactly what Google collects here in terms of data from the thermostat, which is another problem. But if we knew what it was, it's supposedly a learning thermostat. So there's some learned parameters here. I should be able to get them out and run that learning algorithm somewhere else instead. And then, the next day, I should be able to have the thermostat work just as before, or differently, but just as before, without Google being in the picture. Now, of course, someone at Google will fight that tooth and nail, and of course they have good reasons for doing that. But these good reasons apply only to Google and not to anybody else.
I hear what you're saying, and I'll just use an example of my son's car. So I used to rebuild engines. I used to rebuild transmissions. In fact, my first car, or I should say my second car, a 1970 CUDA, muscle car, 383. I completely rebuilt the engine, the transmission, the differential. Whoa. It's a machine. All right, I look at my son's car. So he's got an older, 10-year-old Infiniti, nice GT35. It's all computer based. So I don't have a clue. So we just know that whenever we go to the garage shop, because the light comes on, it's going to be $400. I don't know why, but it's always like $400.
It's a good business.
It's a good business. You're right. There is a good business. But the point I'm trying to make here is, are these products just getting too complicated, for most folks, even those that had experience, to be able to tear them apart? When I hear you talking about the Nest thermostat, gosh, to be able to deconstruct that and replace parts of it, is that even practical, or is that really a goal that you have with computing?
With any computing, I'm not specifically after the Nest thermostat, but I would like to see thermostats emerge that are built friendly, and if they ran my operating system, I wouldn't mind that either. But yeah, you're of course right that products become really, really complex. And a car, of course, is a complex system because everything has to be real time and it's highly safety relevant. So we would not want to have every high school student, hack the engine controller. On the other hand, it seemed somehow you seem to have survived. Your engine could have blown up too in the middle of the freeway. So I think the more interesting question is assume that some other people are competent enough to do something about it. For example, a car repair shop or somebody who happens to be, a hobbyist or a professional, writing software or hardware or whatever it is.
Yeah. In this case,
exactly.
If we're talking business, then it's your company. So it's right. You have the skills.
So it should be possible for, your son as a car owner to say, this particular service model that was offered by the original vendor of my car is something I don't like anymore for whatever reason. I should be able to switch it over to somebody else. And that somebody else might be cheaper or faster or might do things that the original vendor doesn't do or has stopped doing, which is also possible. But for some reason, the model has gone to create lock-in for long after the original purchase. And as you found out with the $400, that is, of course, a great way of making lots of money from your customer over a long period of time.
Every time, $400. I don't know why. Every single time a light goes on, it's $400.
See, it may be that there's just a little timer in there that switches the light on every 2 months. We wouldn't actually know, which is one of the scary parts of it. Exactly.
We wouldn't.
And that's the other part of it. That's bad about these black box systems we put all over in our houses. A few weeks ago, we all read about the distributed denial of service attack from all these webcams. Yes. And, I'm a geek and I have some webcams in my house, but for me to figure out whether or not one of my webcams may have been involved in this particular attack is non-trivial. Okay, and I'm a geek. It is impossible for anybody else. Right. And if I can't even find out whether a device that I have in my house is attacking other people, we're so far away from what it should be. I have no reason to believe that it does what I think it is doing either. It might be recording me all the time and send things off. What do I know?
Yes. So the motto of the story here is the spirit of open source, whatever you want to call, but being able to have portability in your software, in your hardware, and in your cloud or / your data. Is that a generalization?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Generalization.
But personally, I think we don't have to go to complete open source model everywhere. For example, a lot of people wouldn't mind if the hardware isn't open source. Our hardware is whatever it is, and you can probably, hack it yourself anyway, because it doesn't come with a license agreement. You can solder something on if you really want to, but the hardware is cheap enough that it doesn't matter so much. The data and the software is much more important.
So let's shift gears a little bit here and move into the business side of things, because there is a reason for those overlords, or at least I should say there's a reason why we may want those overlords, because they're accessing our data, they're using it for who knows what, but what they are doing, and I'm talking, I guess, from a consumer point of view, and we can talk from a business point of view in a minute, but what they are doing is they're reducing our price. They're reducing the price of I'm assuming anyway, that they're reducing the price of the product because they're utilizing the data that's coming from it in other ways. So if we do pull all our data out from their cloud, put it on our cloud, don't allow them to access it, then what do we do from a business point of view?
Well,
how do we afford it?
The best analogy that I can think of is actually the PC market as it originally was. Because the IoT market is completely different than the way the TPC market was. If you think of it, the first PCs were essentially hobbyist kind of thingies, Apple ones and so forth. And then it could have gone the way the IoT market is going, which is that one vendor would have created a vertically integrated system consisting of hardware, peripherals, operating system, applications, maybe all the way into the retail part. And it could have been one integrated silo, and the vendor, if it had gone that way, the vendor would have argued the exact same way. Only by integrating all of the pieces, can we avoid being such a low margin business that we can't innovate. But that's not the way it went, right? It went the exact opposite way, and different companies could specialize on different things because it became an open, interconnectable kind of ecosystem. And I don't think anybody ended up particularly poor at the end of this market evolution. I think lots of fortunes were made. So I think it proves that a componentized kind of market structure can produce large rewards, and it doesn't have to be vertically integrated. Now,
Yes. So, I mean, now we're coming back, I think, to an older discussion within IoT, and that's these silos. And maybe that's what you're describing, just in a slightly different way, and that is not having silos. Because, like you say, if everything's open and people can innovate more on not the glue technology, but the innovation, the innovations, then everybody wins. The tide rises and everybody is lifted. But so then we're getting back to the conversation, which is an older one in IoT, and that is, and it's particular to protocols, right? If we want to get detailed, but you're advocating then for non-siloed, choosing non-siloed vendors. Is that maybe too simplistic?
Imagine for a second if you go to the store and there's two thermostats you can buy, one of which is part of an integrated, hermetically closed kind of overload system, and the other one has the exact same functionality with all the same components in the cloud and what have you, but it is built from replaceable parts, just like in your PC that you used to be able to take out a graphics card and put a different graphics card in. Which one would you prefer to buy? And even if you have no intention of ever taking a graphics card out or replacing your cloud service or whatever it is, it gives you insurance going forward. And there might be something coming up that you had never heard of, where all of a sudden you do want to have a better graphics card or a better temperature sensor, or you want to have the ability to connect it to something else.
Sure.
And then back to your earlier point about what if we prevented the selling of the data behind our backs, would the prices go up? And first of all, I'm not certain that is true. But if the data has value, it has value regardless who owns and controls it. So I don't see any particular reason why we shouldn't be able to come up with a scheme by which I own my data and I can actually choose to sell it or not sell it, depending on what my preferences are. If I do sell it, the value that I have that I can presumably realize from that data should be just about the same as what the overload vendor can realize when they sell the data. I mean, the data is the data. Now, we do not have an infrastructure by which I, as an individual, could actually sell my data in this particular way. However, there's no particular technical difficulty in doing that, and there's actually a number of startups working on things like that, not specifically related to IoT, but other kinds of personal data.
So then, in that case, the business model, and I want to shift back to the silos in a minute, but the business model would be, okay, here you can buy this product off the shelf, and this is the price if we are able to use your data, or if we're not able to use your data, that's fine, but then this is the price, and maybe it's just a little bit higher.
I think
Is that
so many
realistic?
consumer products, they come with at least if you buy them at Fry's, they come with a coupon of various kinds of cashback if you send in your barcode within such and such amount of time. It could just be the equivalent of sign in here to sell your data to us, and we give you some many dollars back.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and there is a very little downside that I can see for anybody, because the only thing that it enables is a larger variety of how the product is paid for and how it is used, and I think everybody wins in that one, even the would-be overlord vendor, because if the customer has more ways of using their products in a way that makes sense to them, the product is more valuable.
Okay, so I like the concept of this variable pricing. It seems like a fair and honest way of doing things. And yeah, I maybe 99% of the people would opt to share their data anyway, but that's okay, because then it's been even more explicit. And in terms and conditions, with a software device, you're going to have these pages and pages of text that you just check. And I don't read. And a hardware device is a little different, right? You buy it from, let's say, a big electronics retailer like Fry's. It's more like you have to read the packaging, and it says if you buy this product, it should be right. It should be very transparent. The data use terms and conditions for the data. If you do buy this product, then. But I like this because it even makes it a little bit more explicit. That you actually have to do something in order to get that discount, and that way, if you don't, well, everyone's
yes, and there's actually some people who have been talking about coming up with a version of Creative Commons logos for very clearly showing what the device will do with your data. Yeah, and that makes every sense in the world. I mean, if you can buy products based on whether or not they talk Bluetooth because there's a little icon there, why shouldn't we be able to buy products based on what they do with our data or whether they're forkable?
Makes sense. So now let's go back to the silos. Now, is there anything beyond? So if we want to look at the networking protocols, which which allows or prevents the communication between systems. And we can look at them at the radio level, at the network level, and at the application level. If those were open protocols and we weren't using the Zigbees of the world or the Modbuses of the world, on the OT side, then does that completely get rid of our silo issue?
Because, the protocol, at least many protocols implementations come with terms of service. Right.
Okay, we're back to the terms of service.
Right? My IoT device might talk, HTTP, which is about as open a protocol as it gets to a cloud. But if there is a terms of service that sits there that says you may not access this unless you're red-haired and whatever it is, then it's the end of the question. So from my perspective, the technology part of this one, as in this protocol versus that, is far less important than the business intent of the vendor that you do business with. That isn't reflected in the terms of service and the licensing and all sorts of things. The question is, are they pursuing an overlord strategy or are they pursuing some other strategy? And as I've been arguing, I think the componentized play as part of a larger ecosystem where others can innovate strategy is actually a better one because it will grow the market.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up an important point, Johannes, that a lot of people, including myself, don't really dig into, and that is these terms of services. The terms of service, and I think I'm not qualified, and perhaps maybe you are, but I think this is a good discussion to have with some lawyers, that are familiar with this area, because what I'm trying to do is just give everybody some advice in how do they prevent themselves from being locked in? And like you say, technically it's relatively, I'm not going to say simple, but it's straightforward. But where it gets really tangled is going to be on the business side, and I think in particular what that means is really the manifestation of that is the legal ease or the document, basically the contract that you're signing.
Or you're not signing,
you know what I mean?
It's just a contract of adhesion because it happens to be somewhere in your box in a font so small you can't actually read it, but you're bound by it nevertheless.
Yeah. So are we getting now to the motivations of why you started in computing?
That's why I started in computing, but it is my entire philosophy on technology. Technology should fit and should serve the owner of that technology, we should build the technology that way. I think there is way too many dangers in all sorts of dimensions, not just from a business perspective, to hand too many important portions of our lives over to other people. In a democratic environment, we came up with schemes by which we control these other people, called elections and recalls and all of these kinds of things. But in a technology universe, we do not have that at all. If somebody changes the terms of service on you, there is no remedy you have whatsoever. There's no appeals process. You can sue them. There's nothing. There's an alternate way to the vision that I'm sort of outlining here. The alternate way is to have a more democratic process by which the would-be overlords are not so much overlords anymore, but more like representative stewards of a cloud or something like that, with input from their users. Well, not just input, actually. Ultimate the ability to vote them out of office, but I'm not sure that's very realistic for technology. At least I haven't come across anybody who has outlined how it could be realistic. Now, short of that one, I think we need to insist that with our pocketbooks that the technologies that we buy are ones that empower us as opposed to others. And this becomes very, very important. If you think any of the predictions about the IoT market sizes and the number of devices, if any of them is even remotely true, then by not so many years from now, certainly when our children are as old as we are, there will be hundreds, perhaps thousands of devices all around us all the time that are effectively off limits to us. Off limits because we can't see inside them, we can change them. They will be connected to somebody's cloud doing whatever they do, and that is Orwell would have given up writing. I think it's really hard to imagine.
Yeah. No, I know. I feel for you, and I'm trying also, to look at it from the business perspective. And while the advice I think is still good, and that is build portability in your software. So even if you do use a platform, even if it's an open source platform, build portability through an abstraction layer so that you can move your software, and that is the important parts of your intellectual property, to the different platforms. Build portability into your data so that you can, again, abstract it so that you can, and you have to have ownership of that data, obviously, but that you can move to a different mechanism for holding it. But what you're highlighting here is kind of a little bit in the underbelly, and that is the terms of service. And this means we need to also overhaul them and take the appropriate actions to minimize the risk with respect to the terms of service. And I think this is a big part of what you're saying, at least what's resonating with me. That means that we have to really get to the bottom of this a little bit more. I think, again, technically, the recipe is relatively known, but it's going to be this is the stuff that needs to get flushed out. And we're still early days, right? I mean,
it's early days, but on some level, but it is also not, because we have essentially, for better or worse, the overlord architecture, as I describe it, is the de facto architecture. And everybody builds that way. And, if you walk around to people and say you could build things differently, sometimes they look at you like you come from Mars. Not because there is any particular reasoning people tell you wrong, simply because they have never seen that. And that is that's very sad. I mean, for example, if I sold a thermostat, I could be thinking, wait, my thermostat is much more valuable if somebody like Greenpeace and all sorts of other people could put algorithms on my thermostat, because somebody might think that Greenpeace is better at managing energy consumption than somebody else is. This is a much more valuable thermostat for people if they can change that. So rather than thinking I have to, in order to protect my margins, I have to lock everything down, the exact opposite line of thinking may actually be more valid. Now, we don't know what that is, but there has been very little experimentation around it. And so I would encourage everybody to think about, what if we did the exact opposite of conventional wisdom? Instead of locking everything hermetically down, we made it as open as possible. It might have some downsides, but what would be upsides? And I think you would actually find a lot more upsides than would be commonly expected.
And this isn't just a feel-good kumbaya kind of reasoning. I'm looking at it again. I'm looking at it from a business perspective, and this could make a lot of business sense.
I mean, there's many people, not necessarily in the IoT space, that have made openness a core part of their brand, and for one, they tend to command pretty fierce customer loyalty.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can say for me, I'm going to dig a little bit into this. I'm going to start digging into this a little bit more. I appreciate you raising this issue, waving this flag. I think you're doing us all a service. Where can people, Johannes, find more about you?
So,
and
my company's website is at indiecomputing.com. The product UBOS, the Linux distro, is at ubos.net. And I have a blog at upon2020.com.
All right, everybody. I'm going to put this in the show notes as usual. Johannes, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Very invigorating, and I think very enlightening as well. So we'll talk to you soon. Okay. Well, that was episode 72. An excellent number. All 2s and 3s, baby. To get analysis of this episode, links, plus the transcript, go to show analysis notes. You can go to this one, or it's probably easier just to go to iotinc.com/podcast and find this episode. Remember, there's a hyphen between the IoT and the Inc. If you've been enjoying this episode, there's a few ways you can pay forward. The first way is you can share it on social. This helps it get discovered. All you need to do is go to the bottom of the page if you're on mobile, or to the left side of the page if you're in a desktop, and you'll see the icons for sharing. I generally just share it on LinkedIn and Twitter. Number 2, you can leave a review or a rating on iTunes. This would be awesome. All you need to do is go to iotinc.com/iTunes. It only takes a second if you're going to leave a quick review, and just a few more moments if you're going to leave a written review. Haven't had a review in a little while, so it'd be great to get a new one up there. And lastly, this has so far been an epic fail, but if you want to leave a donation, you can go to the episode and you'll see a place where you can do it, and you can enter any amount that you want. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your path to IoT business be a portable one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.